For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. I want to give you this hypothetical scenario. This man right here is Jayden Daniels, and he is projected to go inside the top 3 of the NFL draft, as the second or third quarterback off the board behind USC man Caleb Williams. Daniels was one of the top players in college during his time at LSU, even winning the Heisman last season with the Tigers. And many people expect that he is going to be a very good player at the next level in the National Football League. Now, I want you to imagine that in the days leading up to the draft, completely unprompted, Case Keenum were to come out and say, Jayden Daniels is not a good quarterback. He won't be anything more than a backup. If I were a general manager, there is no way that I'm drafting the man. Immediately, you'd have a few questions. Mainly, why the heck is Case Keenum, completely out of nowhere, picking a fight with Jayden Daniels? Why is an active player throwing punches with a man who hasn't even so much as played a snap in the league yet and hasn't been drafted by a team? You wouldn't know why Keenum was doing this, since it seemed like he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And there's always the possibility that Keenum winds up playing with Daniels at some point, which would lead to an incredibly awkward situation. Well, I bring that up because this man right here is Oakland Raiders legend George Blanda. He's one of the greatest players in the history of professional football, whether it be the NFL or the AFL, and he's a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame for a reason. And Blanda was a guy that could do it all. He could play quarterback at a pretty high level. He could kick the ball at a pretty high level. And apparently, he could also scout quarterbacks and advise teams who to draft and who to avoid when it came time to make their selection at the NFL draft. Because entering the 1974 NFL draft, completely unprompted, Blanda decided to take the time to bash one of the quarterbacks, and one of the highly touted quarterbacks, I might add, coming out and about to hear his name called. As for whether Blanda was right, well, this seemed like a classic case of you were right, but you didn't need to say it. Because this is the story of the 1974 NFL Draft, and the bizarre drama and controversy between Kansas quarterback David Jaynes and Oakland Raiders quarterback and kicker George Blanda. Before I talk about the comments that George Blanda made, we need some context to understand this man right here, as in the player in question that Blanda was talking about, and how good of a player he was in college. When people talk about the greatest quarterbacks in the history of the Kansas Jayhawks, usually you talk about guys like John Hadle and Bobby Douglas. However, this man is also firmly and squarely in the conversation, because this man right here is David Jaynes, and he was really, really good. In fact, he was so good that in 1973, he was a finalist for the Heisman, coming in 4th place in the voting. Jaynes was so good that as the starting quarterback in 1973, he helped guide the Jayhawks to a 7-4-1 record, a trip to the Liberty Bowl, and a 2nd place finish in the Big 8 Conference, which was the last time they came inside the top 2 in the conference since 1995, and was the last time they finished the season ranked in the AP poll since 1992. Jaynes is a member of the Kansas Hall of Fame for a reason, as his 35 career passing touchdowns set a school record at the time for most passing touchdowns in a career, and it was a record that would stand for over 30 years. At the time, only 2 men had ever thrown for 2,000 yards in a single season in Kansas history. Those men were David Jaynes in 1972 and David Jaynes in 1973. I could go on and on about just how good of a quarterback David Jaynes was. He led the Big 8 Conference in completions in both 1972 and 1973. He led the conference in completion percentage in 1972, and led the conference in passing touchdowns in 1973. He led the conference in passing yards in 1972 and 1973, becoming the first quarterback in Kansas history at the time to lead the conference in back-to-back years in this category. And in 1973, he was named a consensus All-America selection after putting Kansas on the map by finishing 5th in the entire NCAA in passing yards, 4th in the entire NCAA in passes completed, and inside the top 10 in the entire NCAA in passing touchdowns. Long story short, this man right here, David Jaynes, was really, really good. And it wasn't a question of whether he was going to hear his name called at the NFL draft in January of 1974, but rather when he was going to hear his name called. He was already being highly touted across professional football's ranks, as the upstart rival World Football League was vying for his services, with the Houston Texans drafting him first overall and hoping to pry him from the NFL's hands. And now, it was the NFL's turn to do the same. However, even though it seemed like people loved David Jaynes and how good of a quarterback he was, there was one man in particular that did not view him that highly and thought he was highly overrated. That man was this man right here, the legendary Oakland Raiders player George Blanda, who was still playing, mind you. He was still an active player in the league, and he was advising people, for some reason, not to draft David Jaynes. Whatever you do not draft the Kansas Heisman finalist, because he is not that good. Said Blanda, while participating in the Bing Crosby National Pro-Am Golf Tournament of all things, I've seen this year's top college passer, David Jaynes of Kansas, and I don't think he'll be any higher than a third-string quarterback in the NFL. Blanda was just golfing, and all of a sudden, Jaynes was catching a stray. Now, when exactly Blanda had the time to watch Jaynes play, I'm not sure, seeing as Kansas was only on national television once all season, which came against Colorado on November 10th, and Jaynes and the Jayhawks won that game. Maybe he also saw highlights of Kansas when he was out in Kansas City on September 30th with the Raiders playing the Chiefs. But even that week, the Jayhawks won their game against Minnesota 34-19. So I'm not sure how exactly Blanda was able to follow along so closely, but he was. Either way, George Blanda was putting David Jaynes on blast. Jaynes said nothing. Jaynes wasn't cocky, and Jaynes wasn't trying to start anything. George Blanda, completely out of nowhere, said that David Jaynes could not play football, and wouldn't even be good enough to be a backup, saying he was a third stringer at best. Whatever you do, don't draft the man, because he's gonna be a bust. I'm just genuinely trying to imagine Jaynes picking up the newspaper, trying to find out what happened in the Bing Crosby tournament, since that was a pretty big deal back then and a whole television event, and he sees his name in the paper as he's being bashed by one of the participants for no reason. The visual is just hysterical. Now you might be saying, well, maybe Blanda did this out of fear that if the Raiders drafted Jaynes, that he'd be out of a job, and he was just saying this to look out for himself. But that wasn't even the slightest bit true. The Raiders were going to go into the 1974 season with 3 players on the roster who could play quarterback. They had Ken Stabler, who was their starting quarterback, and who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. They had Darryl LaMonica, the veteran who you can also learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And they had George Blanda, who didn't throw a pass in 1973, but was securely on the roster because he served as the team's kicker, and he could still throw if need be. The Raiders were not going to draft David Jaynes. They had their starting quarterback, their backup quarterback, and their extremely valuable third-string quarterback, who was really a kicker. They had what might have been the deepest QB room in football, and Jaynes was going to get drafted super early on, so there was no way that the Raiders were going to draft a quarterback. Even with the benefit of hindsight, we know that's true. The Raiders had 16 draft picks across the 17-round draft, and they drafted a lot of good players, including future Hall of Fame tight end Dave Casper, 13-year and 2-time Pro Bowl tackle Henry Lawrence, and running back Mark Van Egan. And you can learn more about how the Raiders drafted him by clicking the card in the upper right corner, because the story behind that is crazy. But none of those 16 draft picks were a quarterback. So there was no threat whatsoever of job security with Blanda making these comments. It's not like someone like Case Keenum telling the Texans not to draft Spencer Rattler, because Keenum knows that if the Texans draft Rattler as a backup, that he's going to be out of a job in all likelihood. Blanda had, quite literally, no reason to do this. David Jaynes just caught a stray completely out of nowhere. He was the target of George Blanda's furor, and no one really knew why. And you might be saying, well, Maybe because this man right here, Dave Jaynes, was the first overall pick in the WFL draft, Blanda was just trying to downplay him, almost like saying, the NFL doesn't need him because he's not that good. So if he wants to go there, it's not a huge loss for the league. However, that doesn't seem to make any sense for a few reasons, and that logic doesn't add up. Number one, at the time of those comments, Jaynes had not been drafted by the World Football League yet, so Blanda was just projecting if that was the reason. Number two, Jaynes never said anything about wanting to play in the WFL or spurning the NFL to play in the upstart league, so Blanda had nothing to worry about in that department. Plus, seeing as Blanda was a legend in another league that took on the NFL headfirst in the American Football League, that would seem awfully hypocritical if he was saying it for that reason, which is why I don't think he was. Genuinely, I don't know what the reason was here. There was nothing to suggest that Blanda was saying this out of jealousy or out of an attempt to downplay the World Football League, because the timeline just doesn't add up in that regard. It just doesn't. Naturally, Jaynes was asked about the comments made by Blanda, and he was just as confused as you can expect when he wondered about why Blanda spoke of him like that, especially after the rival World Football League held its draft, and Jaynes was the first overall pick, getting taken by the Houston Texans. As Jaynes said on this, I didn't read that story, but a couple of people have asked me about it. Well, that's his opinion. I feel a little bit differently about it. Jaynes handled the situation with class, basically saying, I didn't see it, but I think I can play in this league. He took the high road here when he absolutely did not need to, and he dismissed Blanda's criticism that came completely out of left field. Jaynes was eventually drafted in the third round of the 1974 NFL Draft a few weeks later by the hometown Kansas City Chiefs, getting taken with pick number 66 as the second quarterback off the board, only behind Danny White, the Arizona State man who went 53rd overall to the Dallas Cowboys in the third round, and you can learn more about him by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Many felt that Jaynes would have gone higher, maybe even a second-round pick, if he was not chosen first overall in the WFL draft, because there was the fear that he signed with the World Football League. Of course, Jaynes said outright that he was not signing with the WFL, and he had no idea why teams were scared of drafting him when he was going to the NFL. But even despite that, teams decided not to draft him early on, primarily because the last thing they wanted to do with a position as important as quarterback was spend high draft capital, only to get into a bidding war and risk the possibility of undervaluing Jaynes' services. Regardless, Jaynes was now in the NFL, and he had a chance to prove George Blanda wrong, even getting a chance to play against his Raiders twice a year by virtue of being in the AFC West with the Kansas City Chiefs. As for how Jaynes did in the NFL, well, advantage Blanda on this one, because Jaynes threw 2 passes in the NFL, and yeah, this was one of them. An interception against the Pittsburgh Steelers, right into the hands of future Hall of Fame linebacker Jack Ham. This is literally the only surviving clip of David Jaynes in the NFL. Jaynes wouldn't play in the NFL again after 1974, and his final stat line in the league was 0 for 2 with no yards, no touchdowns, 1 interception, and a passer rating of 0.0. I think it is literally impossible to have a worse career from a quarterback perspective than Jaynes had. When you don't complete a single pass, and 50% of your pass attempts go to the other team, and when you end your career throwing more passes to the other team than your own team, I don't think that's very good. If you're drafted by the Chiefs, and you throw more passes to the Steelers than the Chiefs, and you never played for the Steelers, yeah, not a good sign. Just a hunch. So George Blanda was 100% right on the money when it came to the man who played for this team behind me right here, the Kansas City Chiefs. As we've seen, David Jaynes was not a good quarterback. In fact, he was quite terrible, and was yet another example, a classic case, of a guy who was dominant in college and knew how to throw the ball in college, but couldn't really translate that success over to the NFL. So George Blanda was 100% right on this. But still, did he really need to say it? I don't know what he gained from this. I don't know what prompted him to do this, but this seemed to come completely out of nowhere. Just because you were right doesn't mean you have to say it. We're a few days away from the draft if you're watching as of this video getting uploaded. And so far, we haven't had any current NFL players pulling a George Blanda on David Jaynes and just bashing a prospect completely unprompted and completely out of nowhere. But more than 50 years later, and half a century later, this bizarre saga deserves to be remembered for just how strange it was, especially considering the fact that there was no rivalry between the men otherwise, and there was no incentive whatsoever for Blanda to say something like this, especially against a guy that he could have been going up against, or in a highly unlikely scenario, been teammates with. Because I think it's safe to say that when it came to the 1974 NFL Draft, George Blanda's thoughts on the projected top quarterback in the class were anything but bland. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.